You're listening to Sex and Love with me, your host, Dr. Emily Jamia. This series focuses on all topics related to sex and love both here in the US and around the world. My goal is to not only showcase sexually empowered people, but also give a voice to the challenges many face due to the taboo nature of sexuality in many cultures. Bondage, multiple partners, role play, Batman, how do these fit into sexual fantasies? Listen to find out in today's episode where I chat with Dr. Justin Lehmiller, author of Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help Improve Your Sex Life, to learn more about the most common sexual fantasies, the reasons behind them, and how to effectively discuss them with your partner. Only on Sex and Love with me, your host, Dr. Emily Jamia. Hello.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, doing pretty well.
Good. It's so nice to connect with you. So for everyone joining, today we are joined by Dr. Justin Lehmiller. Did I say your last name correct?
It's actually Lehmiller.
Lehmiller. Thank you for that. And is it okay if I call you Justin?
Oh yeah, totally fine.
Okay, great. So Justin is a sex researcher, an educator, and an author. He had a book come out last year, and I want you to introduce yourself in a bit more detail and tell everyone a little bit about your book, because it's what we'll be talking about today. The subject is fantasies.
Sure. So I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. I study the science of sex for a living. But one of the main things that I do with my career is I try and translate the science for the average person in a way that they can use and potentially use to enhance their own sex life and relationships. So I run the Sex and Psychology blog and podcast, which you can find at sexandpsychology.com, where I provide updates a few times per week on what's going on in the world of sex research and what you need to know. So it's kind of the sex ed that you never got in school.
Yeah.
And then I also write books and write for popular media outlets and do a lot of interviews.
Yes, good. It's important. I mean, I feel the same. I think there's so much happening in the field of sex research. I actually just had a paper get accepted, so new research coming out for me as well. But it's interesting, I think, as obviously common as sex is, there's still so much misunderstanding around it. And so I think, as I'm sure you agree, the more we can do to break down the information in a way that's understandable and digestible to people, the better, because it's something that we all need to be informed about.
Absolutely. Most of us never learn what we really needed to know about sex.
I
And we
know.
learn it on our own. So we're here to try and fill in the gaps for you and give you evidence-based information that you can use.
Yes. So you guys are getting quality info today. So thanks again. So let's talk a little bit about fantasies. I have like a list of questions here for you, and I really enjoyed your book. And of course, I've been following you and listened to some of your podcasts as well. Let me just start by asking, what would you say are some of the most common, like the top 3 most common fantasies in America? What did you find?
So I surveyed more than 4,000 Americans. They came from all 50 states. I asked them about their favorite fantasy and the things that they fantasized about at one time or another. There were really 3 main things that almost everybody had fantasized about before. One of them was multi-partner sex, so just doing something with more than one other person at a time. So that could be a threesome or orgy or something larger. The second theme was BDSM, so anything relating to power, control, and rough sex. And then the other big theme was novelty, so just doing something that is new and different and exciting for you. So one of the most common novelty fantasies was sex in a semi-public space. It's not that people actually want to have sex in public and have other people see, it's just that they want that extra risk or thrill that could come along with potentially being caught or observed.
Totally. That makes sense. And what gender differences do you find across those themes? Because as I'm hearing you describe those common themes, I'm thinking to myself, I bet more men fantasize about this. I bet more women fantasize about that. So what differences do you notice?
Yeah, so there are some gender differences when I look at people who identify as men and women, and also those who identify as non-binary or transgender. So when you're talking about differences between men and women specifically, one of the big differences is that men have more multi-partner fantasies and more non-monogamy fantasies than women do. Men also have more taboo sexual fantasies, so fantasies about things that you're not supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
By contrast, women compared to men have more fantasies about BDSM, and that's almost all aspects of BDSM. The one exception is dominance, where you
Mm-hmm.
don't where you see the gender difference reverse, but when it comes to submission and masochism and bondage and discipline, women have more of those fantasies than men do.
Yeah.
The other area where women have more of a certain type of fantasy is they have more of the passion and romance types of fantasies than men
Mm.
do. Now, it's not to say that women have these fantasies and men don't.
Sure.
Most people have these fantasies.
There's,
It's just
as
that,
we know, as sex experts, there's exceptions to just about every rule.
yes. And
Yeah.
just to throw in, for people who are non-binary or transgender, one of the differences I see there is that they actually have the highest rates of BDSM fantasies compared
Mm.
to cisgendered men and women. And
Yeah.
the other area where they differ is that non-binary individuals have more fantasies about kind of exploring their gender and sexuality, which makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. They're a bit
Yeah.
more fluid in their fantasies.
Interesting. So, what do you attribute some of those differences to?
So there's probably a few different factors. Of course, sociocultural factors could play a
Mm-hmm.
role in contributing to what it is that turns us on. So what our culture tells us that men and women are supposed to want might play a role in what they say that they want. But there could be other factors beyond that. For example, when you're talking about multi-partner fantasies, some researchers have argued that maybe there's an evolutionary reason why men have more multi-partner fantasies and non-monogamy fantasies than women, and that gets into
Spread the seed kind of thing.
well, it gets into the whole sperm competition idea, right? That
Uh-huh.
men supposedly evolved to be aroused by situations where multiple men are competing over the same female partner. Uh, and basically, their bodies and behaviors change in ways that are designed to help their sperm outcompete the sperm of other men. So, as one scientific demonstration of this, they had men watch one of two different types of porn, either an all-female threesome or a threesome with two men having sex with the same woman. They masturbated to orgasm, collected their ejaculate samples, and they found that the men released more active sperm when they watched a video with two men and one woman compared to when they watched an all-female threesome. So that's been
That
taken.
is fascinating. I had not heard that before.
So that's been taken as evidence for that, sort of sperm competition idea.
Yeah, very interesting. And then you said women, cisgendered women, tend to fantasize a bit more about like BDSM type of things. What do you attribute that to?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
And I get asked that a lot. And I think there are different ways that you can look at that.
Hmm.
So, one possibility is, well, let's look at the purpose that BDSM serves. And BDSM is often an escape from self awareness. It's a way to take you out of your head and let you be in the moment. And we know that culturally, women are given more messages about sex that say they're not supposed to want sex. And it contribute to a lot of anxiety among women when it comes to sexual behavior. And so maybe
Hmm.
part of the appeal is kind of that change in headspace in a way. Now, it's also interesting, and something that kind of fits in with that is when I look at how fantasies change over age. I was actually looking at that this weekend
Uh-huh.
because I was giving a presentation on women's sexual fantasies and how they evolve over the lifespan. And so I was actually plotting BDSM fantasies on a graph for women in different decades of life. And what you see is
Hmm.
that women's BDSM fantasies are highest in their late teens and 20s, and then they
Hmm.
drop off from
Huh.
there, right?
Okay.
And so I'm thinking that maybe that feeds into the explanation I was just talking about, where younger
Yeah.
women have more of those negative cultural messages around sex. There's a lot more
Right.
slut shaming that happens for young women.
Hmm.
And so maybe it's a way of sort of coping with some of that cultural anxiety that exists
Yeah.
around it.
So like eroticizing something in a safe way, which has a healing effect, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, and
Right.
I would argue, and I talk about this a lot in the book, that our fantasies are therapeutic in many ways, and they're designed
Totally.
to meet our needs at a certain stage in life, and that's why we see a lot of variation in fantasy over the
Yeah.
lifespan.
Yeah, and that's, something when my clients come to me and we talk about fantasies, that I think still so many people have a lot of shame around their sexual fantasies. I mean, I'm sure one of the most common questions you get asked, because it's one of the most common questions I get asked, is this normal?
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting, like when you were talking about the sperm competition element, that sounds like such kind of an animalistic, you know, way of thinking about fantasies, but I also think that our ability to fantasize is one of the things that makes us human and different from other animals. And so I tell people, like, when it comes to your fantasies, don't try to cut off from them, because they can be very healing, they can be therapeutic, they can be fun, they can serve a multitude of purposes. And so it's about developing a healthy relationship with fantasies.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and our fantasies, they say a lot about us too, and
totally.
sort of where we are. And we need to think about them and the diverse factors that contribute to why you're turned on by this thing at this particular point in time.
Right.
So fantasies are telling us something about ourselves and what we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, on the flip side, I do have people sometimes who have unwanted sexual fantasies. Maybe they have had a sexual trauma in the past and they find that for whatever reason, like that's where their mind goes when they're masturbating or when they close their eyes. And so it becomes very disturbing to them. What advice do you have for people who are trying to overcome unwanted fantasies?
Yeah, so a lot of people are uncomfortable with their fantasies for a range of reasons. Um, and part of it, and this is something I've heard a lot about recently, is because of certain cultural messages we're told about what we should want when it comes to sex. So if you talk about something like forced sex fantasies, also known as consensual non-consent fantasies, these fantasies are totally common, totally normal. Most people across genders and sexual orientations have these fantasies, but women are more likely to have them than men. But I've heard from a lot of women recently who don't want to have these fantasies anymore because they, in their real life, are very vocal supporters of victims of sexual assault and violence and want to believe.
Like it goes against their personal value system, right?
Yeah, and so they feel like sort of a traitor to the cause of Me Too
Mhm.
by, saying this about, believing the victims, but then in their fantasy world, they're turned on by this eroticization of forced sex. And
Yeah.
what I tell people for that particular fantasy is that the fantasy is not about rape. It's not about sexual assault. In your fantasy, it's totally consensual. You pick who your partner is, how
Totally.
the situation unfolds, where it
Mhm.
begins, where it ends. And so it bears no resemblance to a real life sexual assault. And so we shouldn't conflate these things.
Right.
So I think
Right.
some of the time we need to look at what is the source of the shame that
Mhm.
people are feeling about their fantasies and how do we help them come to terms with that. And sometimes a simple reframing is all it takes to address that. But then there are other cases where people have really dark, really deviant fantasies about something that is non-consensual and that would get them in trouble in the real world or
Mhm.
would cause harm to someone else.
Yeah.
And there's two things here. One is that having a fantasy like that on a one-off basis, most people will have a dark fantasy at some point, and it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you're a bad person or that you're going to act on it. But when you have those types of fantasies repeatedly, and that's coupled with this desire or fear that you're going to act on the fantasy, that's a different issue, and that's where it's really important to speak with a sex therapist
Mhm.
to figure out coping strategies and how you can prevent yourself from acting on that fantasy that should not be acted on.
Right, right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you talk in your book about the difference between fantasy and actuality, which we talked a little bit about here. What do you say to people who decide they want to bring their fantasy to life? What did you find for people who choose to make their fantasy a reality?
Yeah, so I asked people for their favorite fantasy of all time, do you want to act on this at some
Mhm.
point? And I've conducted a couple different studies on this, and consistently about 80% of people, 4 out of 5, say that they want to act on that favorite fantasy. But only about half of them have ever shared that fantasy before with a partner, and only
Mhm.
about 1 in 5 have ever actually acted on it before. So there's a
Okay.
really big gap between
Yeah.
fantasy and reality. Now, what I find is that the people who have shared and acted on their fantasies, for the most part, report positive experiences. They say it brought them
Mhm.
closer together with their partner. It was fun and enjoyable. And, improve their relationship and their sex life. So
Right.
that tells us that there are some benefits that we can get from
Definitely.
incorporating our fantasies into our sex
Mhm.
lives. But it's important to recognize that things don't always go the way that we want them to, and sometimes the
Yeah.
reality doesn't live up to the fantasy.
Right.
So if you're thinking about incorporating it, um, it's important to do some research and plan ahead.
Yeah.
A lot of communication, and go in with a realistic mindset,
Mhm.
recognizing that if you have sky high expectations, you're just setting yourself up for disappointment.
Exactly.
Um,
It's easy when
and
you're in fantasy land, everything goes according to plan. But of course, when you bring it to life, and I think a lot of people think it should be spontaneous and let me just kind of whisper in my partner's ear what fantasy I'd like to write up, act out right in this moment. And that is not the way to go about it. I completely agree with you that it's so important to push through any feelings of awkwardness you may have or, insecurity. And I think that's what I would guess that's probably what brings people closer in the end because you've been vulnerable, you've shared something about yourself and the fact that you have a relationship where you trust your partner enough to share that information and for them to hold it and participate. I can see how that would be really beneficial.
yeah, and if you plan it out, then you can make contingencies for in case things don't go according to plan. So I think it's
Right.
a really good idea, no matter what your fantasy is, to have a safe word that you can invoke at any point when something goes beyond one person's comfort zone, so that
Right.
there's that exit strategy. And then also, if things don't go according to plan, recognize that that's okay, and
Mhm.
communicate about it, and maybe try it again, but try it differently next time. I think fantasies sometimes take a little bit of practice to make them
Mhm.
perfect when you want
Right.
to act on them. And I see this, for example, a lot with, say, threesomes.
Mhm.
Threesomes are one of the most popular fantasies, but the reality often doesn't live up to the fantasy we have in our heads, because like in your head everything like works out perfectly and everybody knows what they're supposed to do with whom and when.
Yeah.
But in the real world, like, people are like, oh, how do I do this? And
Right.
so it
Who am
takes
I
a little bit
supposed
of,
to kiss? Where am I supposed to touch? There's a
yes,
lot of unknowns. Yeah. Yeah.
practice
We'd
makes
love
perfect.
we'd love everyone who we have sex with to be a mind reader, but it just doesn't work out like that.
No, until we develop telepathy, it's not gonna like work that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. So how can we break the barriers to that prevent us from communicating our desires? What advice do you have for people on that one?
I think the first step is usually self-acceptance, because you
Mhm.
have to feel good about yourself and your fantasies first before you can communicate about them to your partner. So that's one of the things I try to do in the book, is to help you understand what are the most common fantasies, and
Mhm.
odds are the things that you're fantasizing about are the same things that most other people are fantasizing about too. And so if you can help to unburden yourself from the shame and embarrassment, that's a really important first step. And
Mhm.
then when it comes to actually expressing them to a partner, start low and go slow, right? You don't need
Mhm.
to divulge every fantasy you've ever had like right away.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe start at the more vanilla side of the spectrum and work your way
Mhm.
up, and choose the right time and place to have this conversation.
Mhm.
Ideally, when you're both sexually aroused and in a private, distraction free environment. And if you don't have a lot of experience talking about sex, let technology be your friend.
Yeah.
There's some apps that can help you to share your fantasies. Two that I like to recommend are, one is called X Confessions, and the other one
Mhm.
is called Own Your Sex. And they're both sort of like Tinder for sexual fantasies. And so you
Oh,
each
nice.
download it, you say what you're into, and then the
Mhm.
apps will only tell you the fantasies where you're a match. So that's a good, easy, non-threatening
Thank
way.
you, technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a great way to identify your interests without like having to put yourself in the position of saying something that your partner isn't into.
Right, right. Someone commented below, what if they forget the safe word?
Yeah. So,
Rehearse, 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 right?
and I was actually involved in a court case before. So I
Mhm.
often get called as an expert witness in sex-related court cases,
Mhm.
and it was a BDSM-related dispute. And one of the people involved in that case said that they don't use safe words because they're concerned that the other person is going to forget them. But by the same token, if you don't have the safe word, then there's no exit strategy in place.
Right.
So I think it's important to have the safe word, but you can't put all of the burden on, one person
Yeah.
to manage and navigate everything. So I think it's really important that both partners are monitoring each other's verbal and nonverbal
And nonverbal.
throughout. Because
That,
oftentimes, like if one partner doesn't feel like they can invoke the safe word because they don't want to ruin their partner's experience, or they're
yeah.
intimidated, or they forgot the word, the other partner should be observing the nonverbal signs that say,
Yeah.
hey, they're not into it. Let me check in with you and make sure that
Right.
things are okay. So that's
Right.
the approach
Is I think why, probably it would be ill-advised to practice BDSM with someone who you don't trust. And I think, tuning into those nonverbal cues are so important. And, I think it's Willie here who asked that question. If that's the case, I mean, your partner, you need to be able to say, I forgot the safe word. You no longer have my consent to move on, right? And that should kind of trump any safe word that may be there, right? Someone's asking X Confessions, and what was the other app, please, Justin?
It's called Own Your Sex.
Own Your Sex. And maybe you can comment below, Justin, after we wrap up, and that way people can reference those. And anyone who's coming in late, I'm going to save this video onto my IGTV, so feel free to go back and rewatch it. How do you feel someone's relationship status affects the kinds of fantasies that they have?
So when I look at people who are in relationships compared to people who are single, the partners that we fantasize about are different. So for people in relationships, the one person who's most likely to appear in your fantasies is your current romantic partner, which is surprising to a lot of people, because I think a lot of people tend to think, oh, fantasies, like I can have whoever I want, and celebrities and models and all these other things. But no, actually, most of us fantasize about our partners. And it's not to say that we only fantasize about our partners, just that they're more likely to appear than any other person. And that, I think, is something that can be reassuring to a lot of people. But it's also okay if you or your partner fantasize about other people occasionally, or even frequently, because human beings have a need for novelty and excitement. And that's really just the way that sometimes we try to meet our needs. So there's nothing inherently wrong with fantasizing about other people. Now, for singles, the one person who's most likely to appear in their fantasies is an ex-partner. So, more often than not, we seem to be fantasizing about people that we have some emotional connection to. And I think that speaks to the fact that our fantasies aren't just about a sex act themselves. They're also about meeting some emotional need at the same time. And it's easier to have that need met with somebody that you know well who can meet that need.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to the fact that, so many people try to put sex in a box or think that sex and emotion are totally separate. But I think everything you're sharing now about fantasies just emphasizes, how important the role of emotion and attachment is in, our sex life, and ultimately in the kinds of fantasies we have as well.
Yeah, and sex does sometimes happen in a box, literally. Like, if
Well,
you're into
yeah,
that.
I guess if we're speaking literally, that could happen.
That's one of the things I love about studying sex, is that
Yeah.
people are endlessly inventive and creative
Right.
for how they meet their sexual needs.
Yeah, and I think fantasy is such a great way to kind of hone those creative skills and explore different scenarios, whether you or not you ever want to act on them. Again, it comes back to the way I think about it, like using all of our brains' ability as humans to construct really complex storylines. Like, there shouldn't be anything wrong with that. I think it can only add to your individual sexuality or to your partner's sexuality.
Yeah, and I should clarify that you don't have to act on your fantasies to be happy.
Yeah.
And you don't have to share every fantasy that you've ever had. It's okay to
Yeah.
have some fantasies that are just for you,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't have to share with anyone else. That's fine.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's enough to just share a fantasy without going the extra step and acting on it. Because depending on the fantasy, sometimes there are certain risks that people aren't willing to take. And so sometimes people just use their fantasies as a form of dirty talk and get arousal. If that works, great.
Yeah, there are people who will draw on a sexual fantasy to help heighten arousal or get them over the hump to have an orgasm during partnered sex. That doesn't mean that you don't want to just be with your partner. It's just another tool or another mechanism that I think we can draw on to help our sex lives overall to feel more satisfactory.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that our fantasies serve a lot of different purposes. They can help to enhance arousal or maintain arousal during partnered sex or during masturbation, but they can also be a way to cope with boredom, to relieve stress and anxiety, right? So there are a lot of self-care aspects of sexual fantasy too. And we can draw on them to meet our needs at a given moment.
Definitely, definitely. So where can people find your book and follow you and get more information?
Yeah, my website is Sex and Psychology at sexandpsychology.com. You can follow my blog and podcast. The podcast is also available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you can listen to podcasts. And then my book, Tell Me What You Want, is available on Amazon and anywhere else that books are sold.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. It was great to see you.
It was great to see you too. Oh, and there's a question I just saw. Someone asked, how can I participate in one of your studies?
Oh, great question. Yeah.
So if you go to my website, Sex and Psychology, there's a whole page called Sex Studies, and I post my own studies there, as well as studies by sex researchers from around the world. So if you want to take part in a sex study, just go to that page, review the different participation opportunities, and you can take part in as many of them as you would like and make a contribution to sex science.
Awesome. Yeah. And if you asked a question that we didn't get a chance to answer today, feel free to comment below and I'll do my best to answer it, or maybe Justin can go back and take a look as well. And we'll keep the conversation going.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right.
Lovely to chat.
Thank you. All right. Stay in touch.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you liked this video, drop me a like and subscribe below. Share with a friend who might find it interesting. You can also listen to this in podcast form anywhere podcasts are streamed by searching for Sex and Love with Dr. Emily Jamia. Finally, follow me across all the social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamia for daily emotional and physical intimacy tips.